Two small visitors arrive with an unexpected proposal. Montana Territory, October 1891. Pewter. Clouds gathered above the Montana plains as bitter wind howled through the valley. Margaret Sullivan crouched beside her property's boundary marker, gripping a worn mallet while fighting to secure a loose board before nightfall claimed the remaining light. The weathered planks groaned against the autumn chilla, a sound that had become her constant companion through seasons of solitary labor maintaining her homestead. Her final hammer blow sent the nail askew. She cursed under her breath, pride. It loose and straightened when 3 deliberate raps echoed from her cabin. The knocking repeated, more insistent this time, cutting through the whistling wind. Margaret abandoned her tools and hurried toward the front steps, her woolen shawl whipping behind her as she moved. At her threshold, she stopped short. 2 identical little girls stood before her, perhaps 7 years old, their faces pink from cold and golden braids dancing in the breeze. Despite the harsh weather, their small frames remained steady on her wooden porch. The child on the right raised her head proudly and declared, "We heard you need help with your ranch. Our papa cares for you." Margaret's eyebrows lifted in astonishment. "Your papa cares for me?" "Yes, ma'am," the girl replied with confidence. "He handles cattle real well, mends things proper, and shoots straighter than anybody in the territory." Her twin sister held a battered leather pouch against her chest, watching Margaret with cautious, intelligent eyes. Margaret noticed their patched woolen jackets, worn leather boots, and small hands wrapped in knitted mittens. "Where might I find your father?" she asked. "Down at the grazing camp near Willow Creek," the first child answered. "He's too occupied to visit personally, so we came instead." Margaret peered past them into the empty yard, seeing only the muddy trail winding toward the distant cottonwood grove. The quieter twin finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. It ain't too far. We know every step of the way." Margaret folded her arms, caught between wariness and an inexplicable attraction to these bold children. "Do you make a habit of approaching strangers' homes?" "You ain't no stranger," the first insisted firmly. "Papa mentions you regular," her breath caught. She couldn't fathom why a man she'd never encountered would speak her name to his children. "What do I call you too, Rose the Confident?" One said, pressing her palm to her chest. "This here's Lily." The wind rattled her cabin's loose shutter, and Margaret watched both girls shudder, despite their brave faces. She considered sending them away. Darkness was approaching, frost beginning to form. But then she noticed Rose's reddened knuckles and Lily's quivering mouth. "Come inside, both of you," Margaret said, stepping aside. They exchanged a quick glance. Before hurrying through her doorway, Margaret shut out the cold wind and guided them to her kitchen. "Shh! Warm yourselves by the fire," she instructed, stirring the coals until flames danced higher. The blaze brightened immediately, spreading warmth. Throughout the room, she set her kettle to boil and placed a cooking pot nearby. Rose and Lily settled onto the woven rug close to the hearth, their muddy footprints marking the floor. Margaret didn't mind the mess. "What precisely did your father tell you about me?" she inquired while mixing flour in a wooden bowl. Rose answered without hesitation. "He said you labor harder than most men, don't frighten easy, and deserve someone dependable." Lily added quietly, "He said you got a good heart." Margaret paused, her stirring, then continued. "And this father of yours, his name?" "Thomas Mitchell," Rose replied. "Said if you ever met him, you'd know right away." Margaret studied the twin faces before her, one bold, one reserved, both waiting for her response. Outside, the wind battered her walls, but inside, the fire's warmth expanded. She could turn them out or offer them rest and conversation. "Tea will be ready shortly," she said at last. "Then you'll tell me everything." The wind had settled to a steady moan when another knock came. Margaret was cleaning dishes from the table. The twins curled drowsily on the rug near the fireplace, their eyelids heavy from warmth and full stomachs. This knock was confident 3 measured strikes that penetrated the evening quiet. She dried her hands on her apron and opened the door. A man stood on her porch, his hat brim casting shadows across his features, broad shoulders set against the cold. He towered over her, possessing the kind of commanding presence that made everything around him seem smaller. Trail dust and grime covered his long coat. When he spoke, his voice carried deep, measured tones. "Evening, ma'am. I'm searching for my daughters." Behind her, the girls stirred at the familiar sound. Rose peeked around the doorframe, beaming. Papa Lily followed more slowly, but smiling. Margaret stepped back, allowing them to rush toward him. They wrapped themselves around his legs, chattering excitedly about the fire, the fresh bread, and the tabby cat that occasionally visited her doorstep. Thomas Mitchell, for she had no doubt of his identity, rested, one calloused hand briefly atop each small head before meeting her gaze. "I apologize if they troubled you." "They didn't," Margaret replied, though her tone carried an edge cooler than her words. She crossed her arms. "What they did was trek here alone in this wind. It's over a mile from your camp and full dark now." His steady eyes met hers without defensiveness. "I know they've wandered before. I've warned them against it, but they're determined children." His mouth almost smiled, then grew serious. "Tonight I was driving cattle back from the creek when I realized they were missing. Someone at camp mentioned seeing small boots heading this direction. You ought to watch them closer," she said, more sharply than intended. The image of those thin coats against the harsh wind remained vivid in her mind. He nodded slightly. "You're absolutely right, and I'm grateful you welcomed them inside." Duh. Girls continued talking over each other, Rose describing the hot tea, Lily the sweet honey she'd stirred into hers. He listened patiently, one large hand resting on each small back, anchoring them to his side. "I'll take them home now," he said finally, gently urging them toward the door. Rose started to protest, but his quiet look settled her immediately. The threshold, Margaret noticed his posture shift. Without explanation, he reached into his coat and placed a small canvas pouch on her table. The fabric was worn, but tied carefully with string. Beside it, he set a glass jar wrapped in brown paper. She frowned. "What's this, cornmeal?" he said simply, then touched the jar. "Blesses. For your kindness." "That's not necessary." His eyes moved from her to the dying fire that still lit the room. Perhaps not, but accept it anyway. Before she could protest further, he guided the girls onto the porch. Rose turned to wave. "Good night, Miss Margaret." Lily echoed her softly, their voices floating into the chill. Thomas touched his hat, brim a gesture courteous enough to belong to gentler times. "Good night, ma'am." Then he stepped into the darkness with his daughters, their forms quickly swallowed by night and the muffled sound of boots on frozen earth. Margaret closed the door, the latch clicking into place. She stood a moment longer in the stillness. Wind pressing against her walls. The canvas pouch and jar sat on her table, simple but unexpected. She untied the string carefully. The cornmeal was fresh and fine ground, the molasses thick and dark, even in the dim lamplight. She could picture him setting them down without ceremony, as though payment and gratitude were one and the same. The fire crackled in the hearth. She thought of how he'd listened to his daughters, patient and attentive, before guiding them into the night. It had been many years since she'd encountered a man who didn't fill silence with unnecessary words. Margaret stored the cornmeal carefully and placed the molasses on her shelf. She would use it sparingly, she decided, though not from necessity. Something about the weight of that jar seemed to hold more than just its contents. Outside, the wind carried away the last echo of their departing footsteps. Dawn light crested the eastern hills, transforming frost on the fence rails into countless glittering jewels. Margaret emerged with a grain bucket balanced on her hip, the morning air sharp enough to cloud her breath. Two small figures were already at the chicken pen. Crouched low and giggling as the hens scrambled for scattered kernels, Rose spotted her first, jumping up with enthusiasm. "We came at sunrise. Papa said it was fine." Lily, quieter but equally bright-eyed, offered a palmful of feed like a gift. Margaret smiled despite herself. "Seems you've got everything under control." They worked together, spreading grain, until the chickens settled into contented pecking. When the bucket was empty, Rose insisted on helping at the water pump. The handle squeaked as they operated it, water splashing into the metal pail. Lily steadied it with both small hands, her mittens growing damp. Later, while carrying the pail toward the cabin, Margaret noticed something different. The chicken coop's gate, which had been sagging for weeks, now hung straight on its hinges. The wood had been smoothed where it warped, the hardware properly secured. No one had mentioned the repair. The following day, she discovered the damaged section of her north fence had been mended, posts straightened, rails solid. The work was precise, the kind that required more skill than speed. And the morning after that, a fresh bucket of water waited by the well, its surface reflecting the early sky, though she hadn't filled it. Thomas never spoke of these improvements. No note appeared, no casual acknowledgement slipped into conversation. They simply materialized, like frost forming overnight, or sunlight finding its way through her kitchen window, quiet, certain, and without expectation. Rose and Lily became as familiar around the homestead as the barn cats. They followed Margaret through her daily tasks, small boots crunching across the yard, hands eager to collect eggs or sweep grain holes from the porch. Sometimes they chattered about their lessons, or the young bull born that spring. Other times, they simply worked alongside her in comfortable silence. In town, however, the atmosphere changed. Margaret sensed the stares before she heard the whispers, long glances over her shoulders, conversations that hushed as she passed. The first time she caught wind of it, two ladies near the general store were examining a bolt of gingham, one murmuring, into the other's ear. The second woman's eyes flicked toward her, then away, at the telegraph office. An old cowhand with stained teeth asked how Mitchell's ladies were faring. And when she looked puzzled, he only grinned and touched his hat. The talk wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. In a settlement this size, gossip moved faster than the mail coach and stuck longer than dust on the main street. Back at her ranch, twins were chasing an escaped hen, their laughter ringing across the yard. Margaret leaned against the porch, railing, watching as Lily almost cornered it before Rose's boot caught in the mud and both tumbled together. She should remind them to be careful, to stay clean, to remember they'd have to walk home in those clothes. But she didn't. She merely smiled at the scene and wondered, not for the first time, what quality in their father's character had shaped them so. When the sun hung low, painting the fields golden, she carried the day's eggs inside. A faint scent of fresh cut lumber lingered near the entrance. She glanced down and saw her porch step, newly replaced. The wood pale and smooth beneath her feet, another silent repair, another unspoken kindness. She set the eggs on the counter and stood there briefly, hands resting on the worn surface, thinking about the man who moved through her world like this, leaving no trace except the ones that held. Everything together, the harvest festival filled the streets with color and commotion. Vendors lined the town's central avenue, bright with pumpkins, baskets of apples, jars of preserves, catching the afternoon sun. Margaret arranged her own goods carefully, rows of golden squash, crimson apples, polished until they gleamed and honey sealed tight in clear glass. The cool breeze carried the aroma of roasted nuts, and neighbors' voices rose and fell as they haggled over prices. Across the street, a group of men lounged near the tavern's outdoor seating, mugs in hand, their boisterous laughter cutting through the market's hum. One of them thickset, his hat pushed back, separated from the group, and ambled toward her stall. Cal Brennan. His reputation preceded him, connected to too many tales about women who regretted speaking with him. "Well now," Cal said, stopping at her table, "those are some beautiful apples, but I bet you're not just here peddling fruit." Margaret kept her tone even. "A bushel costs 60 cents. Yes. Individual apples are a nickel each." He leaned one elbow on her table, close enough that she caught the sharp smell of whiskey on his breath. "I figure a woman like you could earn more than that with the right gentleman's company." Margaret turned toward a customer who'd been examining her squash. "Ma'am, these will store for months if you keep them somewhere cool," she said clearly, hoping Cal would take the hint, but he remained. "Word around town is you're running that big spread all alone. It's hard labor for a woman. No man to lend a hand. That accurate?" His voice had risen, drawing attention from neighboring stalls. Margaret felt heat creep up her neck, despite the sharp wind. "Mr. Brennan, if you're not here to purchase," a shadow fell across the table. "He's not here to purchase," came a quiet. The voice behind her, Thomas Mitchell stepped up, his frame blocking her view of half the street. He didn't raise his voice, but there was unmistakable steel beneath it. His left hand rested casually on the table's edge, muscles shifting beneath his rolled sleeve. "You're blocking paying customers," Thomas said evenly. "Time to move along. Unless you're looking to lose some teeth." Cal's smirk wavered momentarily. "Now, hold on. I'm just making friendly conversation." Thomas didn't blink. His fingers curled slightly, tightening on the wood. The corner of the table creaked softly under the pressure. The laughter from the tavern had gone quiet. Cal's gaze dropped to Thomas's hand, then back to his face. Something in that look drained the swagger from his posture. He stepped back, boots scraping dirt, muttering, "No need to get all heated." Thomas said nothing more. Cal turned and strutted back toward his companions, who pretended not to watch his return. The tension seemed to dissolve. Margaret's next customer, silver-haired gentleman in a wool vest, stepped forward and inquired about her honey, as though nothing had occurred. Throughout the remaining afternoon, Thomas stayed within sight but out of the way, his presence a quiet anchor. Margaret sold most of her produce, though several baskets of apples and squash remained. When the crowd thinned and the last coins were counted, she began gathering her belongings. Without a word, Thomas stepped in, lifting the remaining baskets, as if they weighed nothing, arranging them neatly in her wagon bed. She reached for one, but he shook his head and completed the task himself. Then he placed a small sack on the wagon seat coffee beans, their rich, earthy scent evident even through the burlap. "For your trouble," he said simply. Before she could respond, he touched his hat and walked away, heading down the street toward the edge of town. Margaret stood by her wagon for a long moment, watching him disappear. Around her, the festival. Wound down, merchants packing up, voices fading with the daylight. She rested her hand on the coffee sack, feeling its substance. For the first time in years, she hadn't faced the town's whispers and sharp edges alone. The wind that swept Margaret Sullivan's homestead carried winter's warning, rattling dried corn stalks in the fields and moaning through cracks in the barn walls. Margaret had been securing the kitchen shutters when she spotted a folded piece of paper wedged beneath her doorframe. No name, no marking, just her own breath misting in the cold as she bent to retrieve it. She opened it by the stove's light. The handwriting was crude, as though scrawled in anger. "Keep letting that gunfighter hang around, and you'll pay for it. A woman's reputation is delicate. Yours will crumble soon enough." The first letter she burned, telling herself it was some fool's clumsy attempt to intimidate her. But the next evening brought another. This one was harsher, cruder, naming her specifically and promising that mishaps befell women who forgot their station. The third warned that her companion would bring violence to her doorstep by the fourth letter. Her hands trembled as she held the paper over the flames, watching the ink curl and vanish. That's when the rear door opened and Thomas entered, brushing dust from his coat. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the smoke rising from the stove. "Nothing of importance," she said too hastily, pushing the last ashes under the grate. His eyes narrowed. "Margaret," she hesitated, then sighed, opening a drawer where 3 other folded notes lay hidden. He read them silently, his jaw tightening with each line. "You should have told me," he said, voice low but steady. "They're just words," she replied. "If we confront whoever's writing these, we'll only encourage them, or end it," Thomas countered. "Cowards rely on silence." Her gaze dropped. "I don't want the girls hearing about this." The matter seemed to rest there, though his expression told her he wasn't dismissing it. 2 nights later, Rose and Lily burst into the house, cheeks flushed, eyes wide. "Papa," Lily whispered. "Someone's lurking by the barn." Thomas didn't hesitate. He took the lantern from its peg, stepped into the cold, and was halfway across the yard before Margaret reached the doorway. "Oh!" A shadow darted between the haystacks. Thomas moved swiftly for his size, cutting off the figure before it could reach the fence line. There was a brief struggle, the lantern swinging wildly. Then Thomas's voice, sharp and commanding. Moments later he emerged, one large hand gripping the collar of a man she recognized immediately Cal Brennan. His face was pale in the lantern light, his hat crooked. Thomas held a crumpled paper in his free hand. "This yours?" Thomas asked, shaking it open. Cal said nothing, but his glare toward Margaret spoke volumes. By morning word had spread. Thomas didn't take Cal to the sheriff immediately. Instead, he led him, wrists bound with ropes, straight into the town center. The square was already bustling with merchants unpacking crates and townspeople gathering supplies. Thomas stopped in the middle of the street and held up the paper. "Read it," he ordered. Cal shifted uncomfortably. "I won't." Thomas stepped closer, the rope between his hands tightening, read it aloud. The crowd's chatter dimmed. Cal's voice was low at first, stumbling over the words, but Thomas's stillness gave him nowhere to hide. By the time he reached the final line, threatening what happened to women who kept improper company, the square had fallen silent. Margaret stood at the crowd's edge, her chin lifted, though her heart raced. She saw the looks people gave Cal, disgust, not curiosity. Sheriff Dawson stepped forward, taking the rope from Thomas. "That's enough. We'll spend time in a cell while we discuss charges." As they led Cal away, Thomas turned toward Margaret. There was no boast in his eyes, no triumph, only quiet certainty. The same look he'd worn when mending her fence or leaving coffee beans on her wagon seat. The whispers that had followed her for weeks didn't disappear that morning, but something fundamental shifted. The town had witnessed firsthand who had been behind the filth slipped under her door, and who had stood before her when it mattered. The night was unnaturally still. Even the insects had gone quiet. Margaret had just banked the kitchen fire when a sharp, acrid odor caught her attention. She frowned, looking toward the window, where an orange glow flickered against the darkness beyond her orchard. "Thomas," she called, already moving toward the door by the time he reached the porch. Pulling on his boots, the glow had become a towering inferno. The hay barn was engulfed, sparks shooting high into the night sky. "Get the girls," Thomas commanded. Leaping from the porch, Margaret hurried to wake Rose and Lily. Their eyes widened at the fire's glow, but they clung quietly to her hands as she led them safely to the spring house. Thomas stood at the barn entrance, his shirt pulled over his mouth against the choking smoke. Margaret joined him, bucket in hand, ignoring his shout to stay back. Together, they passed water and beat back. Flames pushed by wind toward the livestock pen. The thick smoke burned their eyes and lungs, but they didn't quit. Thomas chopped at the burning wall with an axe to create a firebreak. Margaret stumbled in the churned mud, but he caught her arm and steadied her without missing a stroke. When the fire was finally reduced to smoldering heaps, half the hay was lost, but the rest stood in a blackened, leaning structure. Margaret coughed, leaning heavily against the doorframe. Thomas's gaze locked on a set of deep, wide tracks in the mud, none belonging to them. He crouched, running fingers over a dark stain that gleamed faintly in the moonlight, then raised his hand to his nose. "Kerosene," he muttered. Margaret's stomach lurched. "You mean someone started this fire?" "Yes," Thomas said, his voice flat and dangerous, before she could respond. He was already heading toward the pasture gate, lantern swinging at his side, following the tracks into the timber. Margaret called after him, but the wind swallowed her words. The trail led past the creek and over the ridge to a cluster of lanterns marking Wade Porter's cattle camp. Wade leaned casually against a corral rail as Thomas arrived. Well, he sneered. "Didn't expect company this late. Heard you're playing hired hand for the Sullivan widow." Thomas stopped several steps away, the lantern's light highlighting the sharp line of his jaw. "You set that fire?" Wade smirked. "Maybe your lady friend left her lamp too close to the haystack." "Her name's Margaret," Thomas replied evenly. "And you'll confess what you did, or what?" Wade stepped forward, his smirk hardening to a sneer. "You're going to draw on me? I hear you gave up your gun years back after your brother took a bullet meant for you." Thomas's eyes didn't waver. "No gun." He dropped the lantern into the dirt. "We'll settle this with our hands." Wade swung first. A wild arc meant to end it quickly. Thomas ducked and drove his fist into Wade's ribs, knocking the wind from him. They circled on gravel, breathing hard in the night air. cattle restless nearby. Wade lunged, catching Thomas's shoulder, but Thomas twisted and struck Wade's jaw, then drove his fist into his stomach. Wade staggered and tried to grab Thomas's shirt, but was slammed against the rail hard enough to crack the wood. Thomas pinned Wade there, pressing his forearm against his throat. "You're going to sign a confession?" Wade's furious eyes met his with hatred, but he nodded reluctantly inside the dim ranch office. Thomas pushed paper and pen toward Wade. Confession, admitting he set the fire to drive Margaret from her land. Wade's hand shook as he signed, his pride broken along with his nose. Thomas folded the paper carefully and tucked it inside his coat. "If anything else happens to her property, I'll come looking for you again. Next time won't end with just paper and ink." Wade slumped in his chair, defeated, as Thomas walked back into the night. Toward Margaret and the girls who waited by the dying embers of what could have been catastrophe, but instead became the moment everything changed between them.